Hello everyone, in today's video I'm going to show you how to paint a carnation in watercolor. Carnations are one of the birth month flowers for January, and they also can be a little bit tricky, so I can't wait to show you how to paint it today. The brushes I used for this painting are a 3/8 flat brush, a round long size 4 Princeton brush, and then I'm also using my limited palette with Winsor and Newton paints, cad yellow, quin magenta, cerulean, indigo, and sap green are the colors that I have on my palette. For the carnation, we are just going to be using magenta, not mixing it with anything. The first wash we're putting down is pretty light and watery, and we are using the 3/8 flat brush. If you look at a picture of a carnation, the edges are very ripply with all these very light layered petals. And so that's the effect I'm going for by using the edge of my flat brush and kind of wiggling it around to get these really wavy edges to my petals. I'm also trying to get a lot of motion and layers in my petals by leaving a little bit of white space and creating some movement. I want to have some of the petals going up, some of them going outward, but this first layer of petals, we don't necessarily have to define the direction all of the petals are going. We're going to do that with the more detailed, darker colors in a little bit. When you're following a reference photo for flowers, especially one that is as complicated as this, that first wash, just focus on the major shapes that you're seeing, because we really just want to make sure we're getting the petals going in the right directions and the right shaped edges and the right major blobs together, and then we'll go in with some finer details. These carnations up at the top are going to be a little bit more closed off, and I just want you to remember when you're painting any flower that they are the shape of a cone. So all of the petals are open and outward for the circular part of the cone, and then they all come together at a center point where they meet at the stem. So if you keep that in mind, you can make the outside petals fluffier and larger in the circular part, and then make sure to bring all of those edges back down into a center point. Now that we have our base layer, this is the point where we get to use a more pigmented color. In this case, we're just using magenta still, but with a lot less water, and we're using that pigment to define the shape. This is where I feel like a lot of people have so many questions, because it looks like artists are just placing it randomly and it's hard to replicate. So here's my thought process when I'm putting down this intense pigment. I am trying to form the shape of the flower. So this flat base layer doesn't tell us anything about where the petals are pointing and really the shape and color and depth of the flower. So I need the pigment that is stronger to tell the story. Often I will place a lot of the pigmented areas where I see the shadow on my reference picture. I need the pigment to not be even and not be regular shaped, because the pigment is going to go around petals to negatively paint the petals in front of it. So that's why having a reference photo is really important when you're painting complicated flowers like carnations, because you really want to replicate the feeling of how the petals are moving and involved in each other. Also, another thing I feel like I see when people paint carnations is they paint them really open, and carnations are not very open. They're kind of tight, and they kind of are more bunched together than, like, say, a daisy would be open. So make sure that a lot of those center petals that you have, the pigment is kind of going upward to give it the upward shape. So this pigment is going to help define the direction that our petals are going. So the direction in which you paint it, going upward, angling to the right, angling to the left, is going to determine which direction your petals are going. So just thinking about that as you paint it. Another thing that I'm doing as I'm painting the pigment is I'm placing this really strong pigment in those areas that I want to define the shape, to define the shadows, And then I'm rinsing off my brush, and with a damp brush, I'm moving some of that pigment around into the rest of the petal so that it's a little bit softer and not quite as harsh. This is the medium value layer where we want our middle values. We don't necessarily want our darkest values, but we definitely want a punchy amount of color. It's just not going to be the darkest bit of color we have in the end. So we want it to blend out a little bit more, but we don't want it also to overtake the lightness in our petals that we have achieved. So finding that balance of maintaining the lightness, especially around the ends of the petals, and creating some softness in that really harsh pigment that we were putting down, and then letting it dry so we can then come back at the very end and put our darkest value of color to really pump up all of the contrast and define things even further. Once again, don't be discouraged. This is a complicated flower. There are so many ugly stages. We are building upon layers. At one point during this painting, I wasn't sure if I liked it, and then I'm quite happy with the final piece. So just remember that those same thoughts are going through my head as well. For the greenery, I wanted to start with a really bright yellow green, so I mixed in my cad yellow with my sap green to get this really super bright but still earthy toned green. And remember that carnations have this very bulbous greenery point where all the petals meet together, so we're going to add that. It's going to be longer and bigger the more of the carnation petals that we're seeing. So for example, on the two at the top, we're going to see a lot of that bulbous greenery attachment. And then on this bottom one, it's going to be a little bit more squat because we want the impression that some of that is underneath those petals that are kind of open at the bottom. So it gives us more of a perspective that these petals are more open. If we made it longer, it might look like our petals were just kind of floating on top versus tucked inside. Then there are these little green, almost like leaves, but they're called sepal or sepal. I'm not quite sure. And then there's another little bump, and then we get the stem. Give your stem a little bit of a curve for some beautiful movement that's so needed in these really stagnant flowers. And then for the leaves, we are using the shape of the brush to just push up and create the leaves. So you use the tip of your brush and light pressure, push down on the body of the brush, and then drag for the length of the leaf that you want, and then connect it with light pressure on the tip of the brush again. When you do this leaf painting technique, the width of your leaf is dependent on the size of your brush. So my brush is not very thick, which is perfect for these carnations because they have these smaller leaves. But if you have a really thick brush that you're using, a bigger round brush, just put a little bit less pressure so your leaf is not quite as wide. While our stems and leaves and our little bulbous parts of the carnation are still wet, we are adding in darker areas of greenery just slightly because, again, like I talked about earlier, we have our light value of color, which is that lightest bright green that we've created, and then we need our medium value of color, and then we'll go back in with our darkest value to finish it off. This carnation on the upper right, I wanted it to look a lot more like a bud that's just beginning to emerge, so the greenery is a lot more cupped around it to give that illusion. And then I brought the stem down, and then we are just going to continue to add details and shapes to the greenery while it's still wet. My favorite way to add shadow and depth to greenery without necessarily adding too much darkness with browns or reds, or especially not blacks, is to add indigo into my sap green. So I choose an area of my painting that I want to be in shadow, and I'm picking the left side. So I'm just kind of tapping that indigo sap green mixture onto the left side while everything is still wet, and especially under the petals of this front one where the petals are kind of flopped over a little bit onto the greenery so we can get a little bit more shadow. Keep in mind when you're layering, you do not want to lose your lightness in whatever you're painting. So I need to maintain the lightness in my leaves, my stems, my petals. Everything needs to have the light areas, but we also need to have the darker areas for shadow, contrast, interest because the light areas pop when we have a dark area next to it to make it stand out. They complement each other. We need a light value, a medium value, and a dark value. That's how you know you're done. So I can feel as I'm painting this that my leaves and my greenery are starting to be done. But I really wanted to add one final layer of bright green, and it almost makes everything glow when you add it to your stems and your leaves just a little bit. It's almost like it looks like it was a first layer, but you're actually glazing over the top. So that's another way to add a little bit more brightness and detail into your stems and your leaves, even if it's at the end. I feel really happy with where the greenery is at, but now we need to finish off the flower by doing the last layer, that darkest contrasting layer in the petals. So I am picking up the magenta in a very thick, creamy consistency because we are just doing the tiniest bit of contrast and detail right at the base of where we've already put all of that darker pigmented color before. So we're not doing a whole lot, but what we are doing is creating definition and a lot more depth within the flower because we can see a dark, medium, and light value just within one petal. And just remember that less is more. You don't want to overdo it, just a tiny, tiny bit. And then I wasn't going to add this ruffly edge detail, but once I experimented with it a little bit, I really was obsessed with how it looked, and it made the entire carnation just pop even more. So what I did is I just took the edge of my brush and I defined where I already could see the edges of the petals. And I just used a very light, quick stroke with the very tip of my brush so that I wouldn't overdo it. I left enough space that there was some kind of white edge before it got to the dark pink. I also didn't want to overdo it and outline every single edge. I just wanted to give the hint of that nice bright pink tip of the petals that some of the carnations might have. And I think that really helped define some of the petals on the inside of this big main flower, and also define the shapes and the directions I was trying to go for on some of the outer petals as well. When you're doing this technique, also make sure it's kind of random and they overlap and it's not super uniform, and it will look even better because it'll be a little bit more organic. And then of course I do what I do best, which is fiddle with everything. Mess with the pigment, make sure things don't look too even, too uniform. That always bugs my eye when it looks like there's a bunch of lines that are too perfect and too straight altogether. So I had to fix that a little bit. And I thought I was done with the greenery. I told myself I was done with the greenery, but I still had to do one more indigo sap green swipe to really pump up that just a tiny bit more contrast. And it looks good. It looks good, so why not? Just a little bit more. A little bit goes a long way, though. I tried to tell myself it's time to stop. Thank you so much for being here with me today while we painted carnations. Snowdrops apparently are also a January birth month flower, so let me know in the comments below if you want to see that flower painted as well, and I will see you all next time. Bye.